Jesus asked, "Who do people say that I am?" The disciples answered, "John the Baptist, or Elijah, or maybe one of the prophets." All those were good answers, complimentary to Jesus, but they didn't go far enough. If Jesus were only John the Baptist or Elijah or one of the prophets, he would be just one great man among many. Hardly one of a kind, hardly the Son of God, hardly the one to split history in half, before Christ and after Christ. But then Jesus asked, "But who do you say that I am?" And the original Greek here is very specific. You is emphasized. But you, who do you say that I am? These disciples had been with Jesus long enough to form an opinion, to understand that Jesus was more than just another great man. But you, who do you say that I am? Peter answered, "You are the Messiah." He was affirming that Jesus was the one for whom Israel had waited for so long, the one who would return them to greatness. Israel had once been great under King David. When David was king, nobody messed with Israel, at least not more than once. Israel under David was a force with which to reckon. A great nation, mighty in battle, and prosperous in peace. When David was king, there were no Roman soldiers wandering the streets with authority to require Israeli citizens to carry their bags. That was long ago. Now Roman soldiers were everywhere, sent to protect Roman tax collectors and Roman governors. The Israelites hated that. They hated seeing their money siphoned off to Rome. Hated answering to a Roman governor. Hated Romans telling them what to do. They hated not being great. When Peter said, "You are the Messiah," he meant that Rome's days were numbered. The Messiah would get Israel organized, raise an army, drive out the Romans, put God's people back on the map. But Jesus surprised the disciples with his next words. He began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer, kill, and then rise again. Well, the disciples could hardly believe what they were hearing. Peter, always the first to speak, you'll know, took Jesus aside and began to rebuke him. He must have thought that Jesus was he's having a bad day. And then he just needed a little bit of encouragement. I can imagine Peter saying, "Jesus, get a grip! You can't go around talking like that, Jesus. It upsets the disciples. Don't forget, we gave up everything to follow you. You can't let us down now. This talk of a cross, well, it's foolishness. It's just foolishness, Jesus." And that's correct, of course. Exactly correct. The talk of the cross is foolishness. Paul says so in his letter to the Corinthian church. How can anyone solve anything by dying? Except perhaps in an heroic way. No one can solve anything by dying shamefully, and there was no more shameful death than on a cross. Death on a cross was indeed foolishness, but in God's hands, it became wisdom. Jesus' death transformed the cross into a symbol of God's love. The cross didn't make sense except in God's kind of new math, where it added up perfectly. And Christians living in the shadow of the cross have been bearing their own crosses ever since. In the first century, Romans lined the roadsides with crosses to kill Christians. As time progressed, people found other ways to kill Christians, burning them at the stake, feeding them to the lions, beheading them. Given the persecutions that Christians have endured, you'd think that there wouldn't be any Christians left. But the opposite is true. Christ is alive in the hearts of men and women throughout the world. Christ is alive in places where authorities have tried and made every effort to crush the faith. Christ survived Hitler. Christ survived Stalin. Christ survived Castro. Christ survived Mao. Christ is alive in Vietnam. Christ is alive in these hostile places because Christians have outlived their persecutors. They haven't outlived them in years, but in the quality of their lives. People have seen tyrants hating Christians and Christians loving in return. And they've been drawn to the lovers rather than to the haters. Where Christians live according to the gospel, according to Christ's teachings, Christ never loses. Nobody can refute a truly Christ-filled life. As I was reading in preparation for this week's sermon, I came across a story about Martin Niemöller. And it struck me as a good example of a Christ-filled man standing against the forces of evil. Niemöller was a pastor in Germany who opposed Hitler from Hitler's earliest years. When the Nazis began their campaign against the Jews, one of their first measures was to require that the Jews wear a yellow star on their pin to their clothing. It was a small thing, but it was the first step in a journey that would result in 6 million murders. When Niemöller heard of the order, or the edict requiring Jews to wear the Star of David, he announced to his congregation that before one can say the Apostles' Creed, they first must wear the Star of David. Many of you have probably heard of Pastor Lohmann before, but I thought it would be good to tell you some other things about his life, just in case you don't know them, because he's a person well worth remembering. Lohmann had served as a submarine captain during the First World War. After the war, he became a Lutheran pastor. When Hitler required pastors to read a pro-government proclamation from the pulpit, Lohmann refused. When Hitler targeted Christian pastors of Jewish heritage, and there were only a few in Germany, Lohmann opposed him. The Nazis therefore bombed Lohmann's house. Hitler put him in prison for a few months at first, and then again, and again, and again. Friends offered to smuggle him out of the country, but he refused. Then in 1937, Hitler imprisoned Lohmann in the Sachsenhausen concentration camp, and then later in Dachau. In April 1945, Lohmann was scheduled for execution. That month, the Nazis had executed the better-known Dietrich Bonhoeffer. But American soldiers liberated Lohmann before the execution could take place. He was skin and bones, dying of starvation. After his release, Lohmann was reunited with his wife, who had suffered during his 8-year-long imprisonment. Both Lohmann and his family suffered greatly because of his courageous stand against Hitler. Sometime later, a student asked Lohmann how things had gone so badly, how they'd gotten out of hand. And Lohmann famously responded, "First they came for the communists, but I was not a communist, so I didn't speak out. Then they came for the socialists and the trade unionists, but I was neither, so I didn't speak out. Then they came for the Jews, but I was not a Jew, so I did not speak out. But when they came for me, there was no one left to speak for me." You might ask, what did Lohmann accomplish? His family suffered terribly because of his opposition to Hitler, and he nearly died in prison. Wouldn't he have been better off to keep his mouth shut, to work quietly and spend those 8 years in the pulpit instead of in a prison cell? A Catholic priest, Father John Mackenzie, once commented, "The thing about following Jesus is that you don't do the right thing because it works. You do it because it's the right thing." Jesus put it this way, "If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it. And those who lose their life for my sake and the sake of the gospel will save it." I hope that you'll never find yourself face to face with that kind of monstrous evil that Lohmann faced. But it could happen. Christians are suffering persecution in many nations around the world right now. We can expect to face tough choices because of our faith. Employers might expect us to shade the truth so that the quarterly report will look better. Friends will expect us to do things that they know are wrong and will ridicule us when we refuse. We'll be tempted to cheat on our taxes because everybody does it. We'll face 1,000 temptations. And when faced with such temptations, remember the words of that priest. The thing about following Jesus is that you don't do the right thing because it works. Do it because it's the right thing. And remember the words of Jesus. If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it. And those who lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it. That's the purpose. To save lives. Ours and others. The self-denial and the cross-bearing do not have suffering as their purpose, but rather life, eternal life. Amen. May the peace of God, which surpasses all human understanding, keep your hearts and minds in the knowledge and love of Christ Jesus our Lord.